Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, Trócaire recently celebrated 50 years of the incredible work they've been doing to help the most vulnerable all over the world. And join with me to reflect on this, I have Caoimhe de Barra of Trócaire. So I know that you had a little celebration, Caoimhe, recently. Tell us a little bit about what your focus was, what you were reflecting on, and what you're looking towards when we look at the future of Trócaire's work.
Sure. So we had our 50th anniversary conference very recently, but 1973 is the year that Trócaire was founded. And Trócaire was founded with really a very visionary mandate at the time. So in 1973, as you'll remember, or maybe not, but as some people might remember, Ireland was a country that had just entered the European Economic Community, was very recently really taking its place amongst the nations of the world and starting to feel like we can stand up and have a place at the table. But with that also came the sense of responsibility that if we are going to consider ourselves as part of what was then called, the developed world or the richer world, we also have responsibilities. So the founding letter, the pastoral letter on the foundation of Trócaire, speaks very much to that political era and speaks very much to Ireland's responsibilities towards countries that were going through conflict and poverty and injustice. So when Trócaire was given its mandate in 73, it was all about looking not just at poverty, but at the causes of poverty. So in our recent conferences, 50 years on, we were looking at, well, what are the main drivers of poverty now in this current context and era? And what has Trócaire learnt about those drivers? And
have they changed much over the last 50 years?
Well, they have to some degree. I suppose the major driver of crisis now is climate change. So in 1973, there wasn't that much evidence of climate change, but in the last 2 decades, climate change has been huge. In all of the countries that we work in, we have seen massive erosion of development gains as a result of climate change. So, for example, I'm travelling to Malawi this coming weekend, and part of the brief is to look at the damage done just in the last year by the rapid escalation of crises. So there was a typhoon earlier in the year, Typhoon Freddy, and it devastated southern Malawi, but that came after 3, 4, 5 cyclones and typhoons in the last 10 years alone. So what we're seeing is more intense and more frequent disasters hitting more and more countries and more people. So people barely have a chance to recover from the previous disaster before another one hits them. And we're seeing this across the world, everywhere that we work. So Somalia is a country that is just coming out of a very, very prolonged drought, 5 failed rainy seasons, which basically means 3 years of no rain. And then when the rain falls, because the land is so parched, it can't absorb the rain, so you get floods. So this is the impact of climate change that people in these countries have done so little to create, but which is having devastating impacts on their lives. And then the second major driver of crisis is conflict. And we see that in many countries, conflict continues to drive displacement, impoverishment, violence against particularly women and children, and that's hugely complicated. But a third factor, and one we also focused on in our conference, was the space within which organisations like Trócaire's partners can operate. So in many of the countries that we work in, the countries themselves are, have difficulties in terms of the democratic context. So we're experiencing more and more authoritarian regimes, repressive regimes, where citizens can't voice out their own concerns safely and freely to their own governments and require support in order to be able to advocate for more space for what they want to do or say. So we're finding that makes the work that we do and the work that our local partners do much more difficult, because if you are living in a climate of fear, even if you have a very legitimate concern about where government is investing its resources, you might find it very hard to raise that, and that really inhibits development.
And that, I imagine as well, for, as you say, the people that are working on the ground, it's an ever-changing situation. And as it strikes me, Caoimhe, as you're talking about those political contexts, but also the context of various different climate crises that have happened and impacted different countries, is as you're starting to work, all that good work can be turned upside down. How do you navigate that in such a changing world?
So change and complexity are part of our everyday. They're what we live and breathe together with our local partners. And I suppose the thing is, you just have to learn to become more and more agile all the time. So whereas you might in the past have had to prepare for a calamitous disaster every 5 or 10 years, we're now constantly prepared for disasters, be they floods or cyclones or hurricanes or droughts. A drought would be a slow onset disaster, whereas something like a major flood would be sudden onset. So we know how to prepare for these, but the problem is that the resources from, I suppose, the global north, the community that tends to provide resources, it's becoming increasingly difficult to access those resources. So I suppose on the positive side of that global equation, humanitarian funding overall has gone up in recent years, but the problem is that it hasn't kept pace with needs, with the humanitarian needs. So there's a growing gap between what people need in terms of assistance and what's available to support them.
And in terms of just who you're working with on the ground, I know one of the awards that you gave at your conference celebrating the 50 years was to a religious sister, and I think that's one thing that many people will note is the religious priests and sisters that are working tirelessly in so many of the places of Trócaire on the ground, in particularly dangerous areas. Often, sometimes they're the only ones left, laying their lives down. Tell us a little bit about that award and the sister who received it.
Sure. So the Romero Award was established a number of years ago, and it was to highlight the work done by, if you like, the silent, hidden human rights heroes who are working all around the world to protect the communities that they are rooted in. So sometimes the awardees are community leaders. So for example, a gentleman called Abelino Chobcaal from Guatemala was our awardee last year. And this year it's Sr Medhin Tesfay. So Sr Medhin is from Trócaire in northern Ethiopia, and she lives there with her community. They've been there for decades. In fact, they were established in their community in Trócaire 50 years ago, this year as well. So that's a nice coincidence. But they provide basic services to people in Trócaire. They provide education to young people. They provide education to women as well, basic literacy. They provide medical support. And during the conflict that went on until last November, 2 years of really intense conflict, they provided basic humanitarian assistance, so food, medicine, even shelter, and also support for women who were affected by violence during the war, specifically gender-based violence. So the work that they do is extraordinary, and during the period of conflict, nobody was able to get in or out of Trócaire for most of those 2 years. It was also absolutely cut off in terms of communications. So people were extremely isolated, but Sr Medhin led her community and really was a beacon of light and hope for thousands, if not millions, of people within Trócaire. So we wanted to recognise Sr Medhin and her community, but also in doing so, and this is something that I feel is very, very important, the religious sisters throughout the world who have brought their support to communities over decades and decades and decades, quietly, unassumingly, but in an incredibly transformative way, and who rarely get recognition or thanks. So the Romero Award is to give a little bit of recognition to these unsung heroes.
Yeah, and there are so many, as you say, Caoimhe, around the world. Well, thanks so much for joining us on iCatholic today. And I know that many people watching will be awoken once again to the many needs and to the incredible work that Trócaire is doing.
Thank you.